When I was a graduate student, I was working on trying to understand the diversification of marine life in the Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific area has this tremendous biodiversity, not just on land, but in the oceans. And at the time, and maybe, I guess it's really still true, nobody understood exactly where that biodiversity is originating and how it's sustained. But I was interested in the evolution on these islands of various sizes in that area. But in order to understand that, I had to understand how the glacial interglacial cycles of the past 2.5 million years had impacted those faunas, because every time there's a glacial advance, sea level drops by 100 meters, and many of these shallow marine lagoons out in the Pacific disappear, which is the habitat space for these organisms. So little by little, I got more interested in climate change at a geological scale. It was also at about that time that global warming, sort of modern climate change, was really beginning to hit the news in a big way. And in the meantime, there were lots of scientists independent of all of the stuff in the media and modern climate change. We're simply trying to understand the carbon cycle and how the carbon cycle had changed through geologic time. I ended up finding a postdoctoral fellowship in Germany with a guy who was looking at glacial interglacial changes in the carbon cycle. And long story short, he was working on changes in glacial interglacial changes in upwelling. A lot of carbon passes through these upwelling zones where there's tremendous marine productivity. There's phytoplankton and so on blooming and sinking to the bottom. And it was his idea that maybe this had something to do with changes in the carbon cycle through the glacial interglacial cycles. And so we were looking at it empirically with core records, but he also needed somebody to do the numerical modeling of the biogeochemistry to see what exactly was going on. So I did that for a couple of years. It was a complete change from what I had been doing, but it was my first real immersion in thinking about climate change and carbon and the various cycles that in which it's involved. After Germany, when my postdoc was ending, of course, I needed to look for sort of a real long-term job, and my wife and I were thinking that it would be interesting to continue living abroad before we settled down with the family, and I ended up being offered a position in Japan. There's a university in Japan that was very strong in the taxonomic group that I had been studying, a tiny group of crustaceans known as ostracods. And of course, Japan is not too far from the very place that I had been specializing previously. And in addition to that, they had somebody on staff who was very interested in ocean carbon cycling. So it seemed like the ideal thing. It was also, again, a very big change culturally and scientifically. But we moved to Japan, and so I was basically university faculty at, I suppose, sort of the equivalent of a state university in Japan for about 4.5 years before then moving to Ithaca. We moved to Ithaca for PRI. At that time, the guy who's the director of PRI and responsible really for its emergence since the 1990s, Warren Allman, he had taken over in the early 90s, and PRI was not only re-expanding its collections and its research, but also looking to take these incredible fossil collections and make them a community resource in an educational outreach program. So the program was relatively young at that time, but I had grown very interested in education, starting in graduate school, but especially in Japan, because I was doing a lot of time thinking about how to relate science to an audience whose language was not my own primary language, and so I had to think about how to express things in terms that didn't use jargon, and how to use illustrations effectively, and so on. A lot of the things that we use in a museum environment. So I got very interested in education and began looking from Japan for opportunities to work further in science education. And the Paleontological Research Institution was a perfect opportunity for that. Their program was just expanding, and I had a chance to think about what the future of that program should look like. At that time, the museum was just an idea, and a lot of thought had gone into it, but it was still primarily just ideas on paper, and it would be another 6 years after I got to PRI before the museum would actually open. When I first got to PRI, it was a real challenge to reach schools, and so we would typically go to schools rather than their coming to the museum. And in fact, the bulk of our outreach program for a while was in Syracuse and Utica, because we had some funding to reach lots of students in those neighborhoods, and then of course around Ithaca. And but eventually we got a small exhibit space. That was in 1998, and it seems tiny by comparison now, but at the time we thought it was pretty great that we had a couple thousand square feet to have exhibits. And we began to bring in groups a little bit at a time, but really all of that was in some ways prototyping for the Museum of the Earth that would be built later. But in the meantime, a lot of what we developed in our outreach program was developed because we couldn't make a bigger impact through people visiting us physically, so we began to create resources that could go beyond PRI. So we decided, well, teachers would be a great way to make an impact, so we started creating resources for teachers that would be useful in New York State and beyond New York, and we actually developed our website very early on in the process, and other kinds of materials and approaches that could go beyond our physical boundaries.